Hello and welcome to Skipton Baptist Church Online. We're at the start of a new sermon series which will lead us up to Easter, and we're calling this series CrossRoads. And over the next few weeks we want to zoom into a few specific situations and episodes which, although may not be the usual Easter themed sermons, we think are still moments of great significance. Perhaps you've had those moments in your life, those events which just seem to have more meaning or more significance on our onward journeys in life. It could be typical ones like first days of school, college, or work. It could be first meetings with your best friend or the person you end up marrying. It could be maybe a bit more troubling. It could be a medical diagnosis or news of someone passing away, which changes everything. We talk about where were you the moment Kennedy was shot, or when England won the 1966 World Cup. All those kind of things about moments of significance. They could be moments of choice and decision, when that choice dictates a direction of your life going forward. There was a movie in the early 90s that called Sliding Doors, which tells the parallel story of one woman with two scenarios alongside. One where she gets on a train and the other where she doesn't. And it could be how those moments of significance pan out can be very different ways. These crossroads. It could be even the moment where you decided to follow Jesus yourself. In 1916, the poet Robert Frost wrote a poem called The Road Not Taken, and there's familiar words said, "Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by." And that has made all the difference. And so that is kind of what we're looking at. Over these weeks running up to Easter, we'll be encountering moments of choice, of realization and revelation, moments of significance on the way to the cross. And the Greeks had words for those moments. They had actually two words for the concept of time. The first one was a standard word, horas, which meant general time, minutes, hours, etc. But another Greek word, kairos, captured those time, that moment of importance, significance of event, a moment which has repercussions beyond that which is just measurable on a timepiece. And on our first kairos moment, our first crossroads event, we're looking at Mark chapter 8, which in some senses seems far away from the story, beginning of the story of Jesus. There's lots that's happened before we get to this point, and there's still lots to happen before the end in chapter 16. The events that we're looking here are slap bang in the middle of Mark's gospel. Now, you may know I really love Mark's gospel, not only because it's the shortest, it's very action-packed, it goes along at breakneck speed, it's the earliest one to be written down, it has really good authenticity. Peter is one of the main sources of information. It explodes into life from the very first phrase, and it doesn't stop all the way through. We see these scenes going over Jesus' life. He's baptized, he's given his father's seal, he's tempted in the wilderness, he calls his disciples, he casts out demons, he heals many, he calls Levi, he addresses issues of fasting and the law, the crowds follow him, evil spirits are cast out, he sets apart the 12, he's misunderstood, he shares some teaching, he calms a storm, he casts out demons, he heals a woman with a bleeding issue and raises a dead girl. He's rejected in his hometown. He sends out his disciples. His cousin John is executed. He feeds 5,000 people miraculously. He walks on water. He clashes with the Pharisees. He heals a Gentile woman's daughter and a deaf-mute man. He feeds 4,000 more people miraculously, and he heals a blind man. And that's just part one of this story, these two acts of Mark's gospel. And Mark's gospel is not just a random series of different events that Peter reels off and Mark jots down. They are there to back up the statement that Mark makes at the very, very start of verse 1 of chapter 1, where he gives the game away about what this is all about. This is the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. And as I said, Mark's gospel can be seen in two acts. The first act is all these events that kind of outline who Jesus is. And it comes to this hinge point in chapter 8 where it seems to change. And it's not an interval, it's a crossroads moment. And it's at the place called Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus asks the question, "Who do you say I am?" You see, Caesarea Philippi, as recorded in Mark chapter 8, in this hinge point, this crossroads moment, It's a moment of significance for Jesus in his imminent future path, but also for his closest disciples too. It occurs shortly after a strange account of Jesus healing a blind man, seemingly in two attempts. And this seems strange until its relevance is fleshed out in a little bit. This area, Caesarea Philippi in the north of Israel, was actually a center for pagan worship. It was devoted to the half-man, half-goat god Pan. And in its cliffs and its rock edges were niches and altars to many gods. And there was a cave and a spring that came from this cave, which was nicknamed the Gates of Hell. And in case you don't get the thrust of this, what we're talking about here is Jesus is in thoroughly enemy territory. And here, in this place, is where Jesus asks his disciples, those closest to him, who do people say I am? And it's a useful thing to reflect on for us as well. Who is Jesus to those outside of our Christian circle, our Christian bubbles? In our post-Christian culture, there are many competing ideas about who Jesus is. A good man, a good teacher, a role model, a revolutionary, maybe even a fictitious character made up to start a new religion. Perhaps he's just a swear word, a baby in a manger, or a figure on a cross hanging from someone's neck. But what a great question to ask someone in those moments where deep and meaningful conversations come about. What do you make of this Jesus character yourself? Let me tell you, many people think they know who this Jesus is, but dig a little bit deeper and you might discover that at most it's just a mere Sunday school acquaintance with a character from a story, or it's a judgment made on the way that his later followers behave. Here's a little mini evangelism hint or challenge. Next time you're in a situation, ask someone, who do you think Jesus is? And listen to their answers. And if you're really brave, maybe even challenge them to find out more. But Jesus is asking his followers just here, who do people say I am? What's the vibe? Have people got it? Have they picked up on the clues that are there? I don't know if you've ever played something like Guess Who or 20 Questions, trying to work out who your opponent's card is, who that famous person is, through a series of questions or clues. Have they worked out who I am yet? From everything that I've shown so far, do you know who I am? And his disciples say, people are saying you're John the Baptist, Elijah, or one of the prophets. In other words, someone they can already get their heads around, someone they feel they've got a handle on. And then Jesus drops the big question to the disciples themselves. Who do you say I am? And this is the question every single person must face, whether they realize it or not, whether they want to answer it or not. In fact, not answering this question is in itself an answer. It's the question which separates Christianity from all other ideologies, religions, philosophies, and spiritualities. Because Jesus, as referenced in 1 Peter 2, who's referencing Isaiah, Jesus is the stone that makes people stumble and the rock that makes them fall. He is the stumbling block. Who do you say I am? Who am I to you? It is this crossroads where we all must stand and answer. Because it's not just a question for those who aren't at church today. And it's not just for those scary pagans out there who we're terrified of. It's not just for our non-Christian friends or those who are future Alpha invitees, hopefully. It's a question that Jesus asks his closest followers, his friends. So therefore, it's a question that each and every one of us should be ready to answer ourselves. But you might say, but I know who Jesus is. I've known him my whole life. He's my Lord, my King, my Savior, my friend, my Rabbi, my teacher, my God. And I say amen to all of those because they are all absolutely correct. Well done, gold star. And Simon Peter gets it right too. Good old reliable Simon Peter, because if anyone in the Gospels is the one to open their mouth and insert their foot, it's usually good old reliable Simon Peter. And he says, you are the Christ. Now, remember, Christ is not Jesus' surname. It's one of his titles. Simon Peter says, you are Messiah. Now, perhaps you feel well read and understanding of what this means about Messiah. He was the hero of Israel who would come and kick out the Romans. I recently watched a documentary which referenced King Arthur, that legendary king of the Britons who, myth and legend says, the once and future king would return when Albion needed him to defend her shores. And that kind of grasps a little bit of what this Messiah figure was, but there's so much more. Messiah means anointed one, the one who's been set apart by God. In biblical understandings, it was reserved for priests, for prophets, for kings. And that's that understanding of what this Messiah is. This is the king who will come and sort everything out. This is Simon Peter, I think actually speaking on behalf of the other disciples too, making a huge faith statement. You are Messiah. You are who we've been waiting for all along. You are what we need. You're everything we've hoped for. You're the solution to our problems. You can help us get to where we need to be and be the people we want to be. You'll make things how they should be, at least according to us. He gets the correct answer, which is a real relief, isn't it? Because it's usually Peter getting it wrong. At last, he's got it right. And Jesus says, don't tell anyone. This is what's termed the messianic secret. How often in the Gospels do we see Jesus telling people not to go around announcing what he has done? And generally, they ignore him and do the exact opposite and tell everybody. And yet, it's interesting how funny is it now that Jesus has asked us to talk about him more and more, and we so often don't. It's odd, eh? But the reason Jesus wants to keep that a secret is because we notice in John 6:15, after feeding the 5,000, which is also referenced earlier in Mark, the people intend to make Jesus king by force. And so he slips away to avoid this. That idea is the mindset of the people of Israel at this time, including Simon Peter and the disciples, regarding the Messiah, the king who will come and sort everything out. And so what comes next is a complete shock to Peter and the others. And here is this very center of the crossroads moment in Mark 8:31. Jesus then began to teach them. Then, after you've made this declaration that I am the Messiah, and he accepts that title, he then begins to explain it. The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. That's his beginning of explaining what this title really means. The Son of Man must suffer. The Son of Man goes even beyond the title Messiah, and it's not just shorthand or for representative human. It's one of Jesus' most common names for himself, and it finds its root in Daniel 7, this divine, prophetic, messianic figure who comes with angels alongside him to set things right. But the Son of Man must suffer, must be killed, then rise again. Must. Not just will suffer like some kind of inspirational martyr in battle, but must suffer. And we don't fully understand what this is, but Jesus expounds it later in Mark 10, where after explaining again about his death, that the Son of Man, him, has come what to do? To give his life as a ransom for many. And that term ransom is not about a kidnapping, it's more a payment that is needed to set a slave free. And never before Jesus has the idea of Messiah been associated with suffering or death or surrendering willingly. There are references in Isaiah to this mysterious character called the suffering servant in Isaiah 43 and 44 and 45, but it's not been linked to Messiah. And here is Jesus. All these prophetic roads are coming together to this one crossroads junction of images in this one person, Jesus, the Messiah King, the divine supernatural Son of Man, the suffering servant of the Lord, and the sacrifice. But it doesn't make sense to the human mindset. The Messiah is supposed to defeat evil. How does suffering and death do that? Surely that's defeat in itself. That's the mindset. And so it's too much for Peter. And I love this line where it says, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. I can imagine it. You can imagine Peter going, Jesus, let's just talk about this. Because he feels he knows better. So I better set the Lord straight on a couple of things. How audacious. Jesus, what you're saying is not right. That's not how you go about it. You're not actually following the script there, Lord. Now, not that we would ever think that we know better than Jesus, eh? Simon Peter, probably on behalf of the disciples and us, gets the title of Jesus correct, who he is, but not what it means. He was so close, but not quite. He was almost like, I don't know, let's think of an analogy, maybe like a blind man who can't see anything, and then after an encounter starts to see something, but it's not very clear. Maybe people look a bit like trees, and then eventually everything becomes clear. That sounds a bit familiar if you're reading Mark chapter 8. Do you see? No pun intended. So nearly Peter, but not quite. And Jesus turns to Simon Peter and looks at his disciples, and he rebukes him and says, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of humanity." And Jesus' rebuke is incredibly strong here, isn't it? I mean, I know Simon's getting it wrong, but what's new? He often gets it wrong. This is surely just a misunderstanding, isn't it? But Jesus' rebuke is so strong because he knows what lies behind it. Behind what seems a perfectly sensible, well-acknowledged and hoped-for strategy for using power to establish the kingdom of God, it seems a bit harsh to call Simon Peter Satan. Get away from me, Satan. You don't have God's way in mind, but the way of this broken world. You see, what is behind Simon's suggestion that Jesus may have got his strategy wrong is the enemy. And this is but the latest attempt to derail God's rescue plan for humanity. Catherine's going to explore this a bit further next week as we fast forward events into Gethsemane. But we know well that Jesus, after his baptism and affirmation of who he is by Father, is led into the wilderness by the Spirit, where it says he is tempted, he's tested by the Satan. And each of those temptations, you might notice, are about putting Jesus' interests ahead of God's plan. And we are entirely wrong if we think this is the only time Jesus is tempted or tested. So often, if we look for it, we will see in the Gospels so many attempts to detract Jesus from his mission at hand, which is to give his life as a ransom for many. It's interesting to note that the only ones who knew who Jesus was instinctively and what he was really all about in the Gospels, do you know who these individuals are? They're the demons. In a number of power encounters with Jesus, they cry out and announce before time, Jesus is the Holy One of God. So what does Jesus do? He silences them. These are moments where Jesus is being encouraged by his disciples. There are moments even with his brothers to establish power bases, to increase his profile, where, as mentioned, people wanted to make him king by taking up arms. Peter even hides a sword and slices off a guard's ear, to the points that throughout his ministry and even up to the cross, he experiences taunts and jibes to prove who he is with an act of power. Take the easy route, flex your divine muscles, put yourself on the throne, call down fire from heaven, make these stones bread, bow down to me, I'll give you the world, and take the way of power and make it easy. Jesus' reply, you don't have God's way in mind, but the way of this broken world. At each and every one of those moments of testing, of temptation, to follow the way of the world, the way of exploiting power, was a crossroads moment for Jesus. And in each and every one of them, like the words of Tim Hughes' song, Jesus chose the cross. And Simon was so close when he got the right title, but the wrong understanding. An understanding which reflected the way of power, not of love, the way of domination, not of service, the way of the crown, not of the cross. And there's a danger that we can do the same thing. Don't think that we're not susceptible. Remember, these guys had been with Jesus 24/7 for 3 years. They'd seen crazy, miraculous stuff happen, and yet they still got it wrong because they wanted to fit Jesus into their mold. Simon calls him Lord, teacher, king, but on my terms. And we see this so often in our lives and also in big dramatic political ways where people try to claim Jesus for themselves, for their own priorities, concerns and prejudices and plans. I remember growing up in East Belfast where on the walls of some buildings would be murals from paramilitary organisations with "For God" and "Ulster" blazoned on it. Or in Africa, there's what was called the Lord's Resistance Army, where they conducted some of the most horrendous atrocities in the name of the Lord, they would say. We may think we're millennia away from the Middle Ages, and yet the recent attacks by the US against Iran has been framed by some as some kind of retribution in God's name, not dissimilar to references to the Crusades in previous Gulf Wars. And it brings to mind, for me, the Phil Collins song in the 80s, where he says, "'Cause Jesus, he knows me and he knows I'm right." It doesn't have to be those big global, national, institutional things. It's also personal to us too. How often do we call Jesus Lord and yet not act as his servants? How often do we call him King and yet not live as his subjects? How often do we call him Saviour and that still live like slaves caught in the habits and mindset of sin? And how often do we call ourselves his disciples and apprentices and yet don't follow his way, his path, his footsteps? With our mouths and our minds, we call Jesus the correct things, the right titles, yet do we live in a way, even as his alleged followers, which reflect the true understanding of what those titles mean, who Jesus is, and what he and his kingship is really all about? And as a frame of reference to what he means to be a follower of Messiah, Son of Man, the suffering servant, Jesus lays out maybe some of the hardest words for us to hear. But these words are crucial to understanding who Jesus is and what following in his way is about. Then he called the crowd to him along with the disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my apprentice must deny themselves, take up their cross, follow me." Die to self. The only way to gain Jesus, to gain real life. Tim Keller writes in the book King's Cross, he said, "Taking up your cross means for you to die to self-determination, die to control of your own life, die to using Jesus for your own agenda." But we need to be careful that we don't present coming to Jesus as the solution to our problems. He is that, but he's so much more. It's much deeper, more profound than we can possibly think of. Following Jesus is not an addition to your life, an enhancement which makes it better. It's not a ticket for eternity. It does those things, but again, whilst true, to truly access these, it involves surrender. It involves self-refusal. It involves a daily willingness to die to self, our own desires, our own determinations, our own priorities and demands, and live and love like Jesus. Because the thing is, we may talk about being a resurrection people, but don't we realize that first we must be a crucifixion people? It's fleshed out across the New Testament as we eventually see Jesus' followers grasp something of what it means to follow in Jesus' path. In Galatians 2:20, it says, "I've been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me." In 2 Timothy, it says, here's a trustworthy saying, "If we died with him, we will also live with him." And in Romans 6, it says, if we have been united with him in his death like his, we will certainly be united in his life, his resurrection life. This is Jesus preparing his apprentices, his disciples, not only for what's about to happen to him in Jerusalem, but for what it genuinely means to follow him. From Mark 8 and Caesarea Philippi, and Peter is acknowledging Jesus as Messiah. Jesus, according to Mark's account, explains 3 times what it truly means, what must happen to Messiah in the sense of suffering and death. In Mark 8 and Mark 9 and Mark 10, with increasing detail, he's telling the disciples, his closest companions, what will happen to him. But you might notice also, as you read in chapter 8 onwards, from Caesarea Philippi onwards, that Simon Peter, not getting it, what it means, the pattern repeats. After each time Jesus talks about his upcoming suffering, The response from his followers is the complete opposite. In Mark 8, Peter rebukes Jesus and his way. In Mark 9, the disciples end up arguing about who's the greatest. And in Mark 10, we have James and John, two of his closest companions, essentially asking him to be his right hand and left hand man in glory. When you're in charge, can we have some power too? Because they just don't get it. And it must have been so frustrating for Jesus, eh? And maybe it still is in regarding how we live. I had the privilege of being a primary school teacher for many years, and I remember the daily challenge of trying to explain maybe a concept in maths or something, where I'm trying to explain to a child, this is what it means, and they don't get it, so I try another way, maybe a more open way, so I explain it more, and they still don't get it. And then I explain almost to the point of giving them the correct answer, and I say, and the answer is, and they get it completely wrong, and it's so frustrating. And 3 times, I would say at least 3 times, Jesus is giving these descriptions of what is going to happen to him and what it means to follow him. And maybe we think, how could the disciples have got it so wrong? Surely it must have been plain and obvious to them. I mean, in Mark 8:32, it says Jesus speaks plainly about it. Is it really obvious? Or is there something within them and us which instinctively reacts against the idea of self-denial, of giving yourself away, your preferences, your rights and your privileges? We as ever are on the point of privilege of seeing this on the other side of the cross in the empty tomb. We know the ending, and yet so often we're not able to grasp what it fully means to follow Jesus in this way. Not able to handle power in a Jesus-like way. And when we think of power, we might rule ourselves out thinking it's just little old us. We're not presidents or kings or in charge of peoples or countries, but actually we do all have power or the pursuit of it in some way or another. Perhaps in the winning of an argument, putting someone else down through gossip or judging them, pursuing our own way at the expense of another, holding grudges and refusing to forgive, chasing after financial and positional gain and occupations over others, pushing our own view of things as much better than anyone else's, and maybe even saying they're more biblical, choosing not to associate with that person over there because there's something wrong with them or they're not my sort of person, not listening to another and their story or their opinion because they're not worth our time or our interest. So many ways that we could sit and reflect on the daily interactions and situations, encounters and attitudes where we have a choice to make, a choice to advance ourselves and our interests, or to lay down our rights, our agendas, lay down our power, to deny, refuse ourselves in the footsteps, in the following of the way of the cross. For we have everyday crossroads. And the only antidote to the depth of human selfishness and pride, the heart and core of sin itself, is the deeper depths of Jesus' selfless sacrifice. To answer the daily human instinct of self-advancement is the daily Jesus choice of self-refusal. Jesus fleshes it out in practical terms in Mark 10. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, not to take and grasp power for my own sake. That's how humanity works, how the world works. He came not to rule, but to serve. That is how evil is defeated. Ultimate evil defeated by ultimate love seen on that cross. Evil is rooted in the pursuit and the protection of self-interest over God. Dying to self and living for Jesus defeats evil at its very everyday core. He died for us so we can live for him. If at the heart of your worldview is a man dying for his enemies, then the way you influence your world around you and society at large is through service rather than power and control. Even if you're a leader, a boss, a parent, how today is the question. How today in my situation, in my position, can I serve Jesus and those around me? Are my actions, my reactions, my intentions and attitudes serving Jesus or my own interests? There's a line in Mark 10, verse 32. There, on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way, to Jerusalem. It reflects a line in Luke 9:52 where it says, as the time approached for him to be taken to heaven, Jesus resolutely sets out for Jerusalem. He sets his face towards it because Jesus knew who he was, and he knew ultimately where his path needed to take him. And in those lines, we see Jesus' choice to go towards and to the cross for us. And often, as we have seen and we might see next week, those around Jesus would seek for him to go their way with their understanding of what he should do and how he should do it. And each of these would attempt to derail Jesus' ultimate aim, to lay down his life for us and to pay for our sin, to make it possible for us to have real life. Life which is not an enhancement of our own comforts, but a life which follows his footprints, which lead to eternal life. But it's a road which daily involves a cross.